Okay, now going to say a couple of things by way of introduction, and then we'll hand over to Jeremy. First thing I'm going to say is please, 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 will everybody keep on mute whilst Jeremy is speaking. We're recording the session, and if there's background noises, it's really irritating when people are watching the session on YouTube. Somebody's off mute already. So stay on mute, please, most important. Second of all, I'm delighted to say we got over 150 people have joined us already. And so it's just as well we expanded our capacity. We can go up to 500 nowadays. So that's great. Welcome to you from, I imagine, all over the world. I know we got somebody from New York, and I think some people from the West Coast. There's all sorts of people here, which is great. Third thing I'm going to say is thanks very much to everybody who's been making donations. We were able to send a check for 1,200 euros to Il Cuore di Firenze, who are last week, who are buying ventilators for the hospitals in Florence. So that's much appreciated. Please keep the donations coming. The health system in Florence needs your help, and we, the British Institute, need our share of the help as well to keep this thing going during this difficult time. Beyond that, I will just briefly introduce Jeremy Boudreau, who many of you know. Jeremy is the head of history of art here at the British Institute of Florence, and it leads our complete program of courses from medieval through to modern art in Florence. Well known to you as an excellent teacher and lecturer, and tonight he's going to tell us about the whole story of La Piazza della Santissima Annunziata. So over to you, Jeremy. Take it away.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for joining us. I don't know if 40 minutes is sufficient to go through the whole story of the square, but we certainly will try. One thing that I just like to take the opportunity to explain to all of you is the ability to mute your mics. Simon has done that now for the duration of the lecture, but we'd like to open up this Zoom meeting to questions and answers. At that time, you will be able to mute or unmute your own microphone. And in order to do that, you just need to find the microphone symbol. And if you see the red slash through the microphone, that means that you are muted and we will not hear you, children, pets, anything else that sort of comes in through ambient noise. So please be patient with us as we experiment with this new platform. I think so far it's working quite well. And it's a pleasure to contribute this talk to the cultural program. The title of the talk is the Piazza della Santissima Annunziata, and I've given a slight subtitle to this, the Renaissance Crossway of Faith, Charity, and Hope, three theological virtues, hoping to offer an uplifting theme in a difficult time. This is a piazza that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, but seeing that we can now open up these talks to the capacities far beyond the Sala Ferragamo in the British Institute Library, I thought to just give a brief introduction before we start looking more closely at some of the monuments contained in the square. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the city of Florence, the Piazza Santissima Annunziata is one of the historic squares contained within the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Historic Center. It's found directly north of the cathedral, following the Via dei Servi, a religious order that we'll learn about tonight, from the tribunes up to an area which has a lot of interesting history, art, as well as modern day institutions that I'd like to introduce to you. This is an overview of the square in which you can see the basilica and sanctuary of the Santissima Annunziata, as well as the portico of the convent structure of the Servite order, and a bit in the foreground of the men's cloister of the Hospital of the Innocents. Here's another view of that square, which gives you a better view of the tribune or the rotunda found just beyond the high altar of that church. In the center of the square, we have a wonderful work of art by the Mannerist sculptor John Bologna. It was actually his final project, and the casting was executed largely by his assistant Pietro Tacca. This is, of course, one of the Medici Grand Dukes who continued to patron the institutions that we find located in this piazza, as his father, Cosimo I, had done before him. Maybe not so much his older brother, Francesco, who he succeeded as Grand Duke. But certainly his example and that of his father would be followed by his son and heir, Cosimo II. These are marble busts created by Giovan Battista Sermei to adorn various spaces of the portico of the Hospital of the Innocents that we'll be learning about shortly. We will go back in time to understand a bit how the square developed, but many of the works of art that we can enjoy today, at least virtually, are thanks to the patronage of this ruling family. On the rear of the pedestal that supports the equestrian monument, we can find the impresa, or the device of Ferdinando I, which is a historical object, but also one that is very popular here with local Florentines. What you can see is the symbol that was chosen by Ferdinand to communicate in a very rhetorical way his beneficent leadership. The queen bee, obviously symbolizing himself, surrounded by the worker bees or drones, meant to symbolize the productive and obedient members of the Tuscan community. The inscription, Majestate Tantum, reflects the attitude of his rule. Thanks only to His Majesty, the peace and prosperity of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was possible. And this is a popular plaque in the square, and many locals will be able to tell you that it has been a custom for generations to ask children and visitors to the city whether they can count the correct number of bees on this plaque. This is something that you can maybe take a screenshot and do yourself if you like. Generally, the rule here in Florence when you're in the square is no touching. So I won't give you the answer. There are a couple of Spoil Sports online that have put the answer online, but if you'd like to try that and come up with the correct number, it's very difficult to do. I'm going to move on now to some of the views of the piazza, which show that equestrian monument of Ferdinand I commanding over the square. This is a beautiful painting based on a print by Giuseppe Zocchi, which shows us the fashion also of the time in the 18th century. And here we have an aquaforte produced by Carlo Lasigno. This is in the prints and drawings cabinet of the Uffizi, showing the square in a particular moment for which it is still quite famous today, and that is the annual Riffi Colonna Festival. The festival, we believe, gets started sometime around the mid-16th century, maybe a little bit later, and tradition holds that this was an important event offered to not necessarily the residents of the center of the city, but the citizens of the Grand Duchy who had come from the countryside, some as far away as the Casentino and the Pistoiese Mountains, in order to sell their wares of cheese, dried mushrooms, all sorts of things. Because the journey was long and often taken on foot, these peasants would have had to secure their way with the aid of lanterns, and that's what we can see depicted here. Those lanterns have become a big part of the festival in its modern day incarnation. Children will carry these lanterns today through the streets and attempt to blow them out. The reason that they have been such a strong part of this festival is because not only did they illuminate the passage of peasants from the countryside coming into the city, they would also use them as they camped out in the various porticos of the square in anticipation of the fiera that would take place the following day. The Riffi Colonna Festival is traditionally held on the vigil of the Immaculate Conception, and the fair would have taken place on the feast day proper. Here you can see a photograph showing a modern embodiment of that festival, where children from the city parade through the streets with their lanterns, sometimes homemade, sometimes store-bought. But this is a wonderful example of the traditions that date back to the Renaissance that we continue in the city today. The Riffi Colonna Festival is not the only event which makes use of the square. What you can see here is an example of the Music and Art Festival of Florence, which typically takes the Santissima Annunziata Square as its base. You can also see one of the fundraising gala dinners for the Fondazione of the Istituto degli Innocenti, taking advantage of the modern light projections, which you can also see in the square at Christmas time. And down in the corner, you can also see the Fierucola, or the Mercato di Manodopera, which takes place at various points of the year. We have traveling markets, which I'm sure you have seen in other squares like Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce. The fairs that take place in the Santissima Annunziata Square are varied, but again, a wonderful contribution to the activity of the city. Just to talk about some of the monuments that are located in this area, we will be concentrating on two of them, the Basilica and the Sanctuary of the Santissima Annunziata, as well as the hospital turned orphanage turned institute and also museum of the Innocenti. But this is also the location of the Archaeological Museum of Florence, as well as the Palazzo Grifoni Budini Gattai. Lots of our buildings and palaces in Florence have long names that reflect various ownerships throughout the ages. This building was constructed in the 16th century based on the plans of Bartolomeo Ominati for one of Cosimo Prima's secretaries, Ugolino Grifoni. It was later purchased by the Budini Gattai, extensively decorated, as were all of these historic palaces. What I'm showing you here is a photograph of the nave of Santissima Annunziata. You can also see one of the prized objects of the Archaeological Museum, the so-called Medici horsehead, the men's cloister of the Innocenti, as well as the frescoed stairway of the Palazzo Grifoni Budini Gattai. There are many works of art contained within the church, and it's probably because of the long artistic patronage and history of the building that the decision was made to establish a chapel dedicated to St. Luke, which was historically the meeting place of the company of artists known as the Compagnia di San Luca. This is the earliest form of what will eventually become the Accademia of the Belle Arti, or Accademia del Disegno, here in Florence. I'm also showing you perhaps one of the most important objects in the Archaeological Museum, the so-called Chimera of Arezzo, which was also discovered in the 16th century. The Palazzo Budini Gattai today actually houses a very important section of the Kunsthistorisches Institute, the Photothek, which is one of the most extensive historical photograph archives documenting the history of Florence. And what we can see in the bottom corner is one of the new spaces of the recently reopened Museum of the Innocenti, a state-of-the-art display now recording the history and function of that building. These are not the only institutions that we have in the square. Various faculties of the Florence University, as well as the Accademia of the Fine Arts and its associated gallery. The Military Institute of Geography is also located in a section of the former convent of the Servites. We have the Carabini institution, as well as the restoration laboratories of the Ufficio delle Pietre Dure, the Kunsthistorisches, as I had mentioned, as well as several activities located within the Hospital of the Innocents. And I'd just like to point out one of these in particular. Of course, we have the museum, but we also have the Italian seat for research of UNICEF, devoted to the health and education of children, and the Istituto degli Innocenti. And the Istituto, I'll just take a moment to point out as one of the contributing institutes to the foundation that these lectures are helping to support. So I would also like to take an opportunity to thank all of you that have contributed to this campaign of fundraising. It's thanks to your help that we are able to assist in the raising of funds for badly needed respirators and medical facilities for Florence hospitals. Now I'd like to go a little bit into the history of the square and its development. What you can see here are two reconstructions of the urban plan, one dating to around 1420, one from about 2 centuries later. The development of these buildings and the art contained within was carried out gradually over time. And they are thanks to a number of institutions and individuals, most importantly, the mendicant order of Servites, the so-called friars, friar servants of Mary. We also have the Florentine Silk Guild, known variously as the Arte di Por Santa Maria and the Arte della Seta. Those institutions were supported by individuals, including Francesco Dettini, who some of you may know as the famous merchant from Prato, who had left as a bequest the money necessary to establish the Hospital of the Innocents, Piero de Cosimo de' Medici, the father of Lorenzo the Magnificent, as well as Lodovico Gonzaga of Mantua. Here we can see the development of the church that I'll focus on for a bit. It is a complex containing not only the church, but various family chapels, oratories, cloisters, around which were situated the convents of the Servites. But this area, at the time that the Servites arrived in the early 1200s, was outside of the city walls that had been constructed in the 1170s to contain the expanded city. This is the story for most of the mendicant orders that were formed in the early 1200s, including the Carmelites, the Dominicans, the Franciscans. The Servites, who were founded in 1233, had established themselves here. It was an order founded by several members of Florentine families involved in the cloth industry. There was a miraculous group vision of the Virgin Mary that inspired them to construct a mendicant order based on the example of the Order of St. Augustine. And this was the area where the first oratory outside of the city was located. Following the construction of the church and the initial phases of decoration of that building, which was at the time known simply as Santa Maria dei Servi, a very important work of art was produced, and tradition holds that this representation of the Annunciation was painted by a humble friar of the order named Bartolomeo. He wasn't such a great painter and had a bit of a challenge producing the beautiful face of the Virgin. Legend holds that he fell asleep before being able to complete that, and the painting was completed by an angel. And this came to be known as one of several miraculous images of the Virgin Mary associated with the Florentine Republic. Perhaps it was the success of the Servites that inspired other Florentine churches to adorn the interiors of their respective buildings with images of the Annunciation. What we can see here is an example from the Church of Santa Maria Novella. Not only do we have a type, sort of a compositional type for the representation of this event secured with the production and the veneration of this image, even the location of these images is taken directly from the example of the Servite church. So here you can see in Santa Maria Novella, just against the counter facade to the right side of the main portal, we find the example produced by Pietro di Mignato. We would have had similar examples also in the churches of Santa Felicita, San Marco, as well as the Florence Cathedral. Due to the veneration and the importance of this image, important Florentine families continued to invest in the embellishment and decoration of the church, and particularly the area around the image of the Annunciation. What you can see here is the beautiful tabernacle patroned by Piero de Cosimo de' Medici, based on the designs of Michelozzo and Panigilappo Portigiani. This is the famous tabernacle which begins the tradition of leading voti, or offerings, to the image of the Virgin. And the decorations continue throughout time. Here you can see some of the later adornments around the image, going right up through the 19th century. This is the altar on which traditionally Florentine brides would leave their bouquets following their wedding ceremonies in hopes for a prosperous marriage. But I'd like to go a little bit back in time and trace the development of the patronage of this church more carefully, because we have some important examples of Florentine art in the church that I'll point out to you. This is an image of the city as it appeared in the mid-1300s. It is found in another charitable institution, the Bagallo, Here you can see that is actually a detail beneath the feet of the Madonna of the Misericordia of that charitable institution. This, together with the Hospital San Gallo, were eventually fused with the Hospital of the Innocents following its establishment in the 15th century. We know a lot about the actions of these charitable institutions thanks to the chroniclers of the city, most importantly Giovanni Villani, who can be seen here in a commemorative statue in one of the niches of the Mercato Nuovo. It's thanks to the information contained in his Chronica, written just before the arrival of the Black Death, that we know about these institutions. We know about the number of citizens in the city and how they were helped by them. We know that also it's probably the Black Death that's going to bring an end to the writing of Giovanni Villani. His chronicle was actually finished after the plague by his brother and nephew. I'm not going to dwell too much on plague and pandemic because I think we've had enough of that these days. But this is, of course, one of the important reasons that we see an increase in charitable institutions and the sponsorship and patronage of those institutions following the decimation of populations following this epidemic. Here you can see a map which attempts to record the passage of the Black Death through Europe. The big year for Florence is 1348. And when we look at its effect on the population of Europe, it's hard to see following the sort of skyrocketing of population in modern times. But if we were to zoom into that period, we can see an incredible drop in population in the mid-14th century. That is the dip caused by the plague. I believe what we can also see here is a dip in the population following the famous 1630 plague. These are the numbers for Florence as recorded by Villani and his contemporaries. We believe that the city had reached a population potentially upwards of 180,000 people. That was dropped down to about 45,000, and it took a very long time for the city to recover from that disaster. Even in the age of Michelangelo in the 16th century, Florence only had a population of about 75,000 people. The art produced in Florence during the recovery of the Black Death helps to document some of the activities that were brought about by that pandemic. What we can see here is a fresco that was originally on the exterior of the Ospedale del Bigaldo. It was later detached and moved inside of the museum. But what we can see here is basically the assigning of abandoned children to mothers following the deaths of their parents. We have incredible results, obviously, in terms of welfare here in the city, not only in Florence, but throughout Italy and the rest of Europe, namely an economic aftermath involving the recirculation of wealth and property. We have a social consequence. These depopulated cities became void and available now for movement of people into these cities from the countryside. We had political unrest. We also had medical developments that bring about more empirical approaches to health and medicine. Religious effects I'm not going to get too much into today, but artistic consequences as well. Lots of bequests to churches, commissions for tombs and altars, and we have a philosophic revolution that's really inspired by the experience of the Black Death. Solutions in the here and now, or perhaps in the there and then. Simon, I think we might mute all again. Some people have come in later, and if you'd like to do that, I'll just wait a second so that we can continue. All right. One of the major consequences that we have of the Black Death are the founding of hospitals. Some of these hospitals had been extant already in the 1200s, but foundling hospitals in particular are a product of that event. We had already devoted activities to the welfare of orphan children embodied in the Ospedale di San Gallo, as well as Ospedale di Santa Maria della Scala. The Hospital of the Innocents was founded in the 15th century But taking a look at these numbers, we can see that there certainly was a demand following the fusion of these three hospitals in the subsequent century. We have roughly 1,000 children by 1450 being taken into these orphanages. That takes money, and in the case of the Hospital of the Innocents, it is the Silk Guild who decides to sponsor corporately the construction of a new foundling hospital in the Santissima Annunziata Square. I'm showing you here the major and minor guilds of the city. What we have on the top row are the major guilds whose activities spread well beyond the boundaries of the city. The minor guilds were responsible for the control and quality of products and industry, more locally centered, but the Silk Guild was an enormously powerful guild. And when we take a look at their activity, we can appreciate, not only because of the fact that silk is a luxury good, but the activities required for the production of silk, often involving precious metals such as gold, silver, would have also allowed for small metal workers to join into this guild. These are some illustrated pages from a wonderful treatise that we have on the workings of the Silk Guild, which are preserved in the Laurentian Library here in Florence. And I'll point out one in particular, showing a woman at a loom. And I just want to point out that when we see the Silk Guild contributing so conspicuously to the construction of a foundling hospital, it may be the case that the number of women contributing to the production of silk, like wool, could have been understandably a motivation for this. They are not only responsible for the welfare of orphans, but also for the assignment of dowries to widowed women. We can learn a lot about the artists who had contributed to the decoration of the hospital as well as the Servite Church by consulting the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects published by Giorgio Vasari in 1550. He tells us in his life of Filippo Brunelleschi, who incidentally was a member of the Silk Guild, again because of his initial training as a goldsmith, that he was selected following the bequest of Francesco Dettini to contribute the original design for the foundling hospital. Here is a plan of that complex together with some reconstructions. Even though the original plans were designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, the construction lasted for quite some time, and it was largely carried out by his assistants. This is probably because Filippo had taken on many projects in this period. I will point out that it is actually his death day today, April 15th, so I don't want to keep things too dreary, but if you are able to come back to Florence eventually and want to blow kisses to Brunelleschi, you can do that by visiting his tomb, located in the crypt of Santa Reparata, which lies beneath arguably one of his greatest achievements, the dome of the Florence Cathedral. This is the celebrated portico or loggia of the Hospital of the Innocents, one of the final areas to be completed. Again, one of the examples of a rebirth in classical formulas for the organization of public institutions. You can also see here the famous putti of Andrea della Robbia that were added several decades later, often being used as a symbol for the various institutions found within the hospital today. There was also a church. You can see the high altar here, which was painted by Mariotto Albertinelli, but that was a replacement for one of the celebrated works found in the Pinacoteca, or the paintings collection of the museum today, the Adoration of the Magi, produced by Domenico Ghirlandaio. You also have other paintings in the museum that were produced for the family chapels of that church, including this incredible Piero di Cosimo for the Pugliese chapel. The orphanage was divided by the sexes. Here you can see the interior of the men's cloister, and here the women's cloister, adorned with beautiful Ionic columns. And today in the museum, above the portico, you can find the majority of the paintings, which comprise the Pinacoteca, or the paintings gallery. Here's a bit of a variation on a very old theme, the Madonna of Mercy, or the Madonna of the Misericordia, typically represented with her mantle protecting her supplicants. In this case, we can see the Madonna degli Innocenti, or the Madonna of the Innocents, represented by both Domenico di Michelino as well as Jacopino del Conte. There are objects in the museum as well that reflect the history and functioning of the building. This is a sculptural group representing Mary and Joseph, produced by Fra Mattia della Robbia, sometime around 1500. These were actually placed in an area beside an empty crib made of stone, in which mothers could anonymously leave their children that they were unable to care for. Because of the miraculous workings of the image of the Annunciation inside of the Servite Church, as well as the incredible success of the foundling hospital, we can see much attention devoted to the embellishment and the enlargement of the church throughout the 1400s and the 1500s. The major project to update or modernize the church, begun by Piero de' Medici, based on designs by Michelozzi di Bartolomeo, whose brother was also incidentally a prior of the convent, were largely carried out, at least in the case of the Tribune, by Alberti, following the arrival of sponsorship from Mantua in the form of donations by Gonzaga. This is the Chiastrino dei Voti, or the cloister of the offerings, in which ex voti, or offerings of thanks and gratitude, were left by those whose prayers were answered by the miraculous image of the Virgin. The rotunda, we believe, was originally intended to reflect some of the new interest in ancient architecture, particularly circular plans of buildings found in Rome, such as Santa Costanza. This plan I'm showing you here, and perhaps even further afield, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, seeing as it's Alberti who largely carried out the construction of the rotunda. He certainly would have been familiar with this monument. It is, in fact, the inspiration for the sepulchre commissioned by his most important Florentine patron, Giovanni di Paolo Rucellai. Following the Council of Trent, there was major renovations to the church, including important decorative programs, which bring about the frescoing of the tribune vault, based on designs by Volterrano. And so, visiting the church today, it's hard to find some of the earlier paintings. Many of them have been obscured by later programs of decoration in the family chapels. Two early examples can be found by the hand of Andrea del Castagno in the Corbeli and Cagliani chapels. And it's in the cloister of the Voti that we have some of the best preserved examples of late 14th and early 15th century paintings. This is a painting by Alesso Baldovinetti, which was the first to be commissioned for the decoration of the cloister. And you'll notice that it's on the exact same wall as the image of the Annunciation inside. And I'd like to take a moment to pause and look at this painting closely, because it is one that relates to some of the ideas that were shared by my colleagues Simon Gamble and Mark Roberts in previous talks. I know that this doesn't make it into the actual film script, let's say, for A Room with a View. But for those of you who've read the novel, there is a bit of talk of this artist, Alessio Baldovinetti, and even though he's not mentioned in the film, it brings about an important moment which helps us understand the difference between the tourists and the residents of the city at that time. In Chapter 5, Possibilities of a Pleasant Outing, we learn that basically the chaplain, Mr. Ager, speaking with young Miss Honeychurch, suggests a excursion out to the countryside, to the hills of Fiesole and Settignano. And he says, "I'm about to venture a suggestion. Would you and Miss Honeychurch be disposed to join me in a drive someday this week, a drive in the hills? We might go up to Fiesole and back by Settignano. There's a point on that road where we could get down and have an hour's ramble on the hillside. The view thence from Florence is most beautiful, far better than the hackneyed view of Fiesole. It is the view that Alessio Baldovinetti is fond of introducing into his pictures. That man had decided feeling for landscape, decidedly. But who looks at it today? Ah, the world is too much for us. Miss Bartlett had not heard of Alessio Baldovinetti, but she knew that Mr. Agar was no commonplace chaplain. He was a member of the residential colony who had made Florence their home. He knew the people who never walked about with Baedekers, who had learnt to take siesta after lunch, who took drives the pension tourists had never heard of and saw by private influence galleries which were closed to them. Living in delicate seclusion, some in furnished flats, others in Renaissance villas on Fiesole's slope, they read, wrote, studied, and exchanged ideas, thus attaining to that intimate knowledge, or rather perception, of Florence, which is denied to all who carry in their pockets the coupons of Cook. This, of course, leads to the subsequent chapter with its hilariously long title that took the film 3 frames to introduce, which is arguably the most important moment of the film here, this excursion out to the countryside. So while the screenplay doesn't really mention Baldovinetti, the whole reason that this is adapted to the film is because of the views introduced by the frescoes of Baldovinetti. And here is that landscape in the adoration in all its glory. This is the first of several frescoes depicting scenes of the life of the Virgin, as well as one of the founding members of the Servite order, Filippo Benizzi. And it was because of the success of these frescoes that the artistic importance of this church begins to enter history. Even though we have, again, major innovations in the following century, we do have some important works of art in Florence today that represent the High Renaissance, the early 1500s. These are 2 paintings which are still located in Florence today. They were part of the high altarpiece that was commissioned from Filippino Lippi. He died before being able to complete it, and so the deposition, which would have been facing the choir, and the Assumption of the Virgin, which would have faced the audience in the nave, the congregation in the nave, were completed by Perugino. The altarpiece itself was dismantled, and there are several fragments that are found in collections around the world, but these are still located in Florence. And the reason that this was commissioned from Filippino Lippi is following the disappointment of the Servites, who had hosted Leonardo in the convent, we believe in the late 1400s, following his service to Lodovico Sforza in Milan. It was here, of course, that he produced the cartoon that is so celebrated in the National Gallery today. He was supposed to produce an altarpiece for the Church of the Servites based on this theme, with the patronage of the Florentine Republic, who of course hold St. Anne in high regard. This is also a birthday here, so it is Leonardo's birthday, and I'm glad to add that in addition to a death day. If you're in London, once that opens back up, you can go and admire this painting. You can also see an earlier work that came from the Servite Church, the celebrated Martyrdom of St. Sebastian, which was produced by Antonio del Pollaiuolo for the Pucci family. Members of that family in later generations were able to finally complete the loggia of the church, the exterior portico, and this is based, most people believe, on the original designs and intentions of Brunelleschi. It had already, of course, been continued by Antonio Sangallo the Elder and Bacciadagnolo in the form of the Servite cloister on the opposite side of the square. Vasari himself is involved directly in the furnishing and decoration of another space in the Servite church, and that is the Cappella di San Luca that I had mentioned earlier. This was the meeting place for the founders and earliest members of the Accademia del Disegno. It is also the location in which several important members of that Accademia are buried. If you've read The Lives of the Artists in English, you've probably come across one of the modern paperback versions that like to put this painting on the cover. It is in fact a painting made by Vasari representing St. Luke, who tradition holds had painted the first image of the Virgin Mary, and that is the altarpiece for this chapel. It is also the location of an important pontormo that had been detached from a church that was demolished in the late 1800s in the Piazza dell'Olio. So taking a look again at the outside of the square and remembering that while guilds and mendicant orders were responsible for the establishment of these institutions, it was the Medici Grand Dukes that continued to patron and sponsor them. Entering into the refectory of the women's refectory of the convent, we can see an incredible fresco produced by Bernardino Percetti that was commissioned by the son of Ferdinand I, Cosimo II, in this case a gruesome representation of the massacre of the innocents, which has on the right-hand side some telling details that record the everyday life of the convent. I guess we can imagine that this juxtaposition of Herod as terrible leader and Cosimo II as sort of good leader is meant to remind everyone of the importance of the Medici support and sponsorship of the activities of the Institute. Here we can see the foreground in which Belier or wet nurses are nursing children. We can also see the boys in the background receiving education. So while there's something admittedly depressing about the fact that there has been historically a need to receive unwanted children, the museum today, which reopened in a very state-of-the-art way in 2016, records that quite beautifully. The first extent into that museum actually looks at some of the material culture associated with the leaving of foundlings, such as this token, a broken button. We can imagine that the mother would have kept one half of the button and in hopes of being reunited with her child, be able to identify that child even years in the future. In the portico remains the ruota, the so-called ruota dei esposti, on which unwanted children would be left anonymously. That was only closed in the 19th century, even though the activities of the hospital and the orphanage continued right up into modern times. So when you're able to get back to Florence, even if you've only got a day, this is a great place to get started if you'd like to learn more about the incredible history of arts and culture in the city. I'm hoping that you've enjoyed this virtual tour. It is painful for me to be doing this virtually. Obviously, in our courses, we like to bring students here firsthand to experience the architecture and the art that remains, but I'm confident that we will be able to do that in the future. And so thank you for joining us. I'm hoping that this has been a highlight for your afternoon if you're on lockdown like I am. I'm certain that we will be able to maybe not have summer festivals, but hopefully by the time we get to September, the children of Florence will be able to continue with the tradition of the Rificolona. And at this point, I will open up the talk for questions. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Jeremy, if you get rid of your presentation, then we can see more people on the screen. And then we can, there we go. So if anybody has a question or a comment, just unmute yourself and speak. And if you're not speaking, try and put yourself back on mute, please, because then we won't have too much chaos. But on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was a fascinating talk. Santissima Annunziata is the most beautiful piazza, but I didn't know you were in a quarter of that before, so thank you. So thoughts, questions, feedback?
Posso dare can I
Please,
make
Julia.
a question? Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, Julia.
Yes, I was made a servite at the altar in the Santissima. Right, I looked down at the floor and it was the tombstone for Andrea del Sarto, who of course is written about by Robert Browning and who also writes about the statue and the bust in the square. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning adored the Santissima, although she was very Protestant and anti-Church of England or the Catholic Church. She just falls in love with the Santissima and puts it into her Aurora Leigh. And I find what's fascinating about Florence, it's not the Medici. the glue of Florence is all of these social organizations of charity. The Misericordia, who carried the sick and the dying and buried the dead 700 years ago. The Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, founded by Dante's Beatrice's father. The Buon Uomini di San Martino, which is Renaissance, not medieval, where still to this day, they're the 12 anonymous men who divvy up the proceeds each week and give it to the proud poor. And I put a letter in their letterbox about a family. And the next time we got a phone call from Guicciardini saying they were sorry they couldn't help us because it was an Albanian family and they would only help Florentines. But they gave us the addresses where we could go. And the only one of these institutions, like the Bigalo and so forth, that isn't still functioning is Or San Michele, which was a granary to feed even the enemy in time of famine. And I feel that that's where the energy and the great art of Florence was. Santissima is fascinating because Leonardo was there, Pontormo was there, Andrea del Sarto, so many of the great artists. And I'm very grateful for your talk.
Thank you, Julia. It's a challenge to fit any corner of Florence into a 40-minute talk. We could easily construct semester-long courses, in any of these buildings. The challenge for me was to avoid, laundry listing, which I think for many people becomes overwhelming. How many tombs and altarpieces and commissions we have, and I've lost hours over the last few weeks just learning myself, some of the bits and pieces of that church that I've never had an opportunity to before. I know we've got some bookworms in the audience, and so I have put together a bibliography that can help people learn a bit more about some of the material I've introduced, and if you like, I can share that now.
Thank you.
We can even put it up on the website, Jeremy.
I'm just going to throw it right up into the chat, and people can download it for.
Put it in the chat. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. Other contributions. Other thoughts.
I have a question. Did I get the numbers right for the bees? I got 135.
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say that's incorrect. Try again.
Okay. You're not going to give me a hint.
Nope.
All right.
I have a question, Jeremy.
Yes. I've just uploaded the bibliography now.
Regarding abandoned children versus orphan children, a couple questions. The children that were set out in the Lodge of the Bigalo, were they specifically one or the other? And then you mentioned hospitals being constructed after the Black Death. Were most, the ones that were specifically for children, did they tend to be orphaned, which I could understand more relating to the Black Death, whereas the Innocenti that was for abandoned children, I don't make a connection with abandoning a child, particularly with the Black Death. Is there a connection with that? Or
I think that there's a bright side and a dark side to this idea. While we have certainly the caring of foundlings already in the Middle Ages, we even have ruote or wheels for the consignment of those children centuries earlier. These were activities that were absorbed into larger charitable works. Hospitals would be looking after the poor. There were hospitals dedicated to pilgrims. There were hospitals dedicated to women and children. There were hospitals dedicated to specific types of illnesses. What we see in the Innocenti as a novelty is the fact that it's basically corporate sponsorship for this type of activity, specifically relating to children. The fact that infant mortality and also, unfortunately, the number of women that died in childbirth is staggeringly high in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. That's certainly a contributing factor. I think if we want to be a bit more cynical about it, we can also appreciate that the inheritance and the traditions of primogeniture in early modern Europe encouraged many to intentionally sire illegitimate children as a backup strategy. You know, if your first child dies, if your first daughter dies, where does the dowry go? You know, who inherits the business and the title? So whether or not there is a strategic sort of, you know, production of illegitimate children to ensure bloodline, you know, that could be a part of it. I think what we have to appreciate is just that there were many children who, even if their parents couldn't, were alive, you know, they weren't orphaned in the sense that their parents were dead by disease. You have many families whose mothers are lost. You have many families who are simply too impoverished to ensure, you know, the upbringing of the children. There's some interesting work and research that's been done on how many, especially in the 1600s, women would volunteer themselves as balie, as wet nurses, to be able to get into the hospital, to be able to nurse their own children. So I mean, there's some heartbreaking, you know, history there. But I think it's a very muddy sort of area to think about. I'd imagine that the intentions in the case of the Innocenti Hospital has to do with the particular attention given by the Silk Guild to the women of their industry.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, contributions?
Hello, I'm a jewelry school student in San Frediano, and I'm writing my art history paper on images of healing created in Florence after 1348. And you've given me a lot to think about with this lecture. Would you say these are the two key instruments?
If you're talking about miracle working images, they tend to be pre-Black Death. There are three miraculous images of the Virgin Mary associated with the city of Florence. One is the Annunciation at the Santissima Annunziata. Another is the image of the Virgin in the tabernacle at Orsa Michele, and another is found outside of the city at the sanctuary in Impruneta. And they all are sort of associated with different areas of crisis and distress. The Impruneta icon, for example, was the image that was typically called upon during times of drought, of famine. She's sort of the weather goddess when it comes to the Florentine Republic, and we know that you know, when the rains wouldn't fall, when the fields couldn't be cultivated, that the city priors would deliberate, you know, whether or not they had to process the Madonna of Impruneta all the way in through the hills of Chianti into the city. It would typically be exhibited on the rostrum or the ringhiera of the city hall, where contingents of guildsmen and city officials, as well as citizenry, would pray collectively to that icon. So you've got different sort of ideas and applications that are given to the different images. But I would say start there. The interesting thing with the Madonna of Impruneta as well as the Madonna of Orsa Michele is that they are both reproductions or largely overpainted images or replacements for earlier images. And that is absolutely no problem for the faithful. You know, the power of these images are transferred from one embodiment to another. So you know, it's a great place to think also about how the image really is a, I don't want to say a substitute, but it is a focal point for meditation and for prayer, representing, you know, the same figure of the Virgin Mary.
Thank you.
Any more for any more? We're coming towards the top of the hour, I think. Oh, we've got 4 minutes till the top of the hour. We can even go over a little bit if people want to keep chatting. It's not like we've all got the hot dates to go to tonight. Maybe we have.
I'm seeing a question in the chat, Simon, about the surname Esposito. I'm not. I'll just read this. I'm from the US, and Italians have told me that the surname of Esposito was a surname given to children born out of wedlock. Esposti is one term that we have, and also in Florence there are tons and tons of surnames that come from the history of the Innocenti, degli Innocenti, several variations of that. I think that the last child that was accepted by the Ruota before it was barred in was named Ultimo Lasciati. So Lasciati is also another surname that seems to come from the history of the orphans. Proietti, seeing lots of people coming in with other surnames here in the chat. So yeah, that's a big part of also the identity of Florentines, you know, leading back to this monument.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yes.
The first child who was exposed, Esposita, at the Innocenti, was Agata Smeralda.
Yeah.
And there's now a very fine Progetto Agata Smeralda, which helps families and orphans in Brazil. And also they help me with the Roma. The Roma were bulldozed out of their shacks on the coldest day of the winter in 2010, and 40 of them went to sleep under the loggia the Innocenti, and nobody helped them. I set up alphabet school with them and begged them to find a different habitation because it was annoying everyone, and they finally did. And I pay one of them to clean the pavement of the Santissima Loggia. And on the base of it is written in Latin that Pucci gave this to the Florentine public. I felt so good about I cleaned it too. That marble floor is the statement in Latin echoes that in the Bible of the floor of the Jerusalem temple built by Solomon. And I think that's the energy of the place that we need to, as scholars, as art historians, and even as the beggars, to appreciate and work for, to preserve.
One of the things, honestly, regarding my own teaching and the Santissima Annunziata, despite its incredible quantity and quality of works of art, you know, it is one of the few Florentine churches that was never museumified. You know, you can barely ever go in there without finding people, you know, and they don't put the faithful off into some kind of chapel where you don't see them. I mean, the image of the Annunziata is right there when you come in from the cloister. So you find Florentines with their shopping bags, you know, yes, stopping in for a prayer, saying hello to their image of the Virgin. And it is still, for me, a place where I really would prefer to sort of introduce the space and its art in the classroom and encourage people to visit individually as opposed to, you know, miking up and going in with groups. Yeah. But that's part of the joy of Florence, you know, that's why I love the city, because you still have the living, breathing city all around you.
Yes, the Florentines told me that there are 4 churches in the square. There's a church in the Innocenti. There are 2 in the Santissima, because there's the chapel for the Pucci family, yeah, which had the St. Sebastian, which it no longer has. And it was very badly damaged in the flood. But there's also the church of San Francesco and Paolo, where they feed 100 poor people every day. I don't know if they're still able to do that now with the coronavirus. But it is a square that's based on charity. And I think that's what creates its beauty. But I also feel that Santissima is a glorious model. It's not, you know, the perfect style of San Lorenzo. And I prefer it for being that kind of model, where the artist spontaneously. Do you remember that there's a monk in the aula for the Voti who's looking out of the window? It's painted by Andrea del Sarto. In the next window is the lily, which is the emblem of the Servites. And it's those jokes also that I love. And also there's the Madonna del Sac, the, she's painted over a doorway, and she's on a sack of wool. And that was very much beloved by the Victorian art historians, who spoke of it as a very fine painting.
There's a wonderful copy of that painting also in the Academia by Irene Parenti-Duclos that they were talking, she made the news, you know, sort of climbing up on a ladder with her hoop skirts to make the tracing to produce that copy. All right, Simon, I don't know if we have a time limit on this, but I imagine if we do, we're probably approaching it.
We're over the hour, just over the hour. Whether Zoom will now shut us off, maybe they won't, because we got this extension package so we can have 500 people on. We only got to 190 today, so we've got some distance to go yet, but that's a fantastic result, and really pleased that people from all over the world have been enjoying it. The comments have been really encouraging. And I just remind you all that we do need those donations, so don't forget to do that as well. Next week, same place, same time, we got Alan Pascuzzi, who again will be known to many of you, another excellent lecturer, another historian of art and artist living in Florence, and he's going to be talking about the context for the Renaissance from some of the social, cultural and domestic perspectives. And so we'll let you all know the details of that, as always, in the What's On message on Monday morning. If you're not on our mailing list, as most of you are, then just drop us a line and we'll put you on. If not, you can check the website. It's all up there on the website. And yeah, we'll keep this going as long as we can. And I think we'll probably keep on doing it even when we're back live, because people in Seattle can't necessarily turn up for Wednesday evening talks at Palazzo Lamfedini every week. So yeah, I think that's it for now, unless anyone's got any last thoughts. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Sarah, for your support in putting this together. And I hope to see many of you same time, same place next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.